Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So we're work session, voting session. Oh, I don't have my glasses. Sorry about that. I can't do anything without my glasses. We're taking up Senate Bill 528, Climate Solutions Now Act. We are second on this bill. It's come over from EHE. And, go ahead.
So this is Senate Bill 528, the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. It's similar to a bill you saw last year. I'm going to give you a very, very high overview of the bill and then turn it over to April Morton from EHEA, who has been handling the bill and living with the bill downstairs, and she is the expert on what the bill does. But as introduced, the bill was designed to make broad changes to the state's approach to reducing statewide greenhouse gas emissions and addressing climate change. Specifically, the bill increases the statewide greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirement and requires the state to achieve net zero statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. It establishes requirements for monitoring methane emissions from landfills, establishes new and alters existing energy conservation requirements for buildings in the state. It increases and extends specified energy efficiency and conservation program requirements, establishes requirements for the purchase of zero emissions vehicles and buses and other parts of the state's fleet, and it establishes new entities and new special funds that are going to support all the activities that are required in the bill. Now, I know EHE's made some changes, so I'm going to turn this over to April, and she's going to give you an overview of what EHE did to the bill.
Maybe not just what they did to the bill, but what's different from last year.
Sure.
What we passed last year out of this committee.
Sure. So good afternoon, everybody. As Matt said, my name is April Morton. I'm counsel down in EHEA. So that was a pretty good overview broadly of what the bill does. I'd say there's kind of 5 categories of provisions in this bill. The first dealing with emissions reduction planning and monitoring. That's the section that's going to be the most similar to what was in the bill last year. Energy efficiency and clean energy. Climate justice and jobs, zero emissions vehicles, and finally, sort of a looser category that I'm going to call climate investments. And I'll sort of go through broadly what is going on in the bill as amended in each of those categories. So again, just like last year's bill, this bill establishes a target of achieving 60% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. And requires the Maryland Department of the Environment to create a final plan that will set the state on that path by December 31st, 2023. It also sets a goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2045. That, just like last year, that goal is subject to a sunset in 2026, so that the General Assembly would have to come back and consider whether that goal is still reasonable at that point. There are also provisions dealing with regulating and monitoring methane emissions from landfills. This is very similar to what was in last year's bill. There is a new provision requiring the Department of the Environment to actually establish methane emissions regulations for landfills. Some background, that's something that the department has already sort of been in the process of doing. There were some amendments in the committee mostly in response to MACO's concerns about that process or what the resulting regulations might look like, to first off say very explicitly that the department has the authority to exempt or make allowances for landfills under certain circumstances. One of the circumstances that was raised was landfills that have been capped and on which solar panels, for example, had been established. Also added by amendment some language requiring the state to cover up to 50% of cost if there's a cost difference between monitoring and capping emissions under the state regulations that is higher than what is sort of allowed or required under federal regulations. Also added through amendment is some language requiring a study on state land suitable for use as composting sites. Composting and sort of diverting organic material from landfills has been shown to be an effective way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On the energy efficiency and clean energy side, this bill has some requirements in it for buildings that are pretty substantially different from last year's bill. I will say up front, the bill as it came in included 2 recommendations from the Maryland Commission on Climate Change in their most recent report that came out this past summer. One of them was for the state to adopt for all new buildings an all-electric code going forward so that subject to a cost efficiency or effectiveness test that would really be strongly encouraged for all new buildings to be all electric rather than relying on natural gas or other fuel sources. Those provisions are cut from the bill, so all of those are gone. What is there in their place are a couple of studies, one being done by the Public Service Commission to look at what the impact of that sort of electrification process would be on the grid and what sort of investments would be necessary if the state does decide that we want to move in that direction. And then also require the Building Codes Administration and the Department of Labor to look at more at the technical side, what buildings really can be electrified efficiently and effectively, what sort of technology would that entail, and what would a more electrified building code actually look like. In terms of existing buildings, this was also heavily amended, but largely to clarify and extend the timeline a little bit. For existing buildings, there's a defined term of covered buildings in the bill. It's buildings that are over 25,000 square feet, but explicitly exempted from that definition of covered buildings are both public and non-public K through 12 schools, historic properties, and agricultural buildings. So those are not covered by this, these provisions that I'm about to discuss. The bill, as amended, requires the Department of the Environment to adopt what are called, sometimes called BEPS, but Building Energy Performance Standards. And big picture, what those sort of look like is, and they have been established in Washington, D.C., Washington State, a couple of other jurisdictions around the country have started moving towards these types of standards. Including, I think Montgomery County is actually in the process of doing them as well. But basically what happens there is the Maryland Department of the Environment looks at a big picture goal of reducing direct emissions. And so this bill is only concerned with direct emissions. So those are the emissions put out by buildings by burning fossil fuels on site. Establishes a goal of reducing by a 30% reduction by 2035 and achieving net zero emissions by 2040. I will say that 2040 goal, just like the net zero goal for the statewide greenhouse gas planning purposes, is subject to a sunset. So that one would sunset in December 31st, 2029. But anyhow, so the MDE would look at that big picture goal of achieving those reductions, but then would set energy use intensity targets by building category that are targeted at kind of getting us to that overall reduction. So it's not a requirement that each building reduce its emissions by 30%. It's a requirement that the department sort of look big picture. How do you achieve that 30% reduction overall? Again, there's a lot of language in the bill giving the department flexibility to account for things like building age, geographic conditions, and the needs of different types of buildings. And that's also something that those studies that I previously mentioned would also be looking at and advising on. The bill also sets up, this also is new through amendment, a grant program in the Department of Housing and Community Development funded with a $5 million mandatory appropriation in fiscal years 2024 through 2026 to improve energy efficiency and install renewable energy generating systems in covered buildings. So those are those large buildings that are subject to this these new energy performance standards that house low to moderate income households. There are additional requirements for state buildings and schools that are identical to last year's bill, reducing the threshold for state-funded buildings that are required to be high-performance buildings, which are, that's a current requirement that they be LEED, silver, or better, essentially. Currently, that applies to 100% state-funded buildings. This would lower that threshold to 25% funded capital projects. There's special provisions for school construction. Requires one of the schools constructed in each jurisdiction over the next 10 years to achieve net zero energy balance, and makes a $12 million per year makes $12 million per year available in grant funding through the Net Zero School Grant Fund, so that school systems could receive grants of up to $3 million to design and construct net zero energy schools. Again, there's a lot of outs sort of built into the language that allow the IAC to waive that requirement when necessary. There are provisions dealing with Empower Maryland. Again, this is no change from last year's bill. There is language in here on a tax exemption, personal property tax exemption for community solar projects. We are aware that the language in this version of the bill is a little bit different from what this committee has just put out on the floor. I think our chairman's preference would be to address that through a floor amendment to just conform this bill to budget and taxes bill, but obviously that's in the hands of the committee. There's establishment of a new climate transition and clean energy hub in the Maryland Energy Administration to serve as a clearing center for information on advanced technology and architectural solutions for decarbonizing buildings. On the climate justice and jobs front, there's language, again, very similar to what was in last year's bill about what the Maryland Department of the Environment, in conjunction with the Environmental Justice Commission, which is an existing commission, have to look at and study related to climate change. There's the establishment of a just transition employment and retraining work group under the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, again, basically identical to last year's bill. New in this year's bill, there is the establishment of a Maryland Climate Justice Conservation Corps. This is very closely modeled on the Chesapeake Conservation Corps and would be set up to employ young people to work on clean energy and climate mitigation projects with a focus on promoting climate justice and doing hands-on work in urban areas and communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. In the original bill, just like the Chesapeake Conservation Corps, this would have been under the auspices of the Chesapeake Bay Trust. However, as the committee amendments actually move it out of the Bay Trust and under the Maryland Department of the Environment would be responsible for the program. There are new requirements for the state to increase the percentage of vehicles in the passenger cars and light-duty vehicles that are zero-emission vehicles in the state vehicle fleet. There are some requirements related to local jurisdictions and the purchase of electric school buses to the extent that federal and state funding is available to them. And then finally, on sort of this climate investment front, we have the bill provides $5 million per year for 3 years to capitalize the Climate Catalytic Capital Fund in the Maryland Clean Energy Center. So this essentially functions, the Maryland Clean Energy Center already sort of functions as a green bank. This would sort of ramp up that funding so that the money could be leveraged for funding climate-related initiatives. And the hope there is to take advantage of some federal funds that look like they're coming for state green bank initiatives. Finally, through amendment, there was an addition of $500,000 per year in fiscal years 2024 through 2028 for the Maryland Healthy Soils Program. This is a program under the Department of Agriculture that looks at things that have to do with, or one of the benefits of this program is that it provides some carbon sequestration in cropland and agricultural land. So that's big picture, everything that's in the bill.
Okay, let me start by talking about the money. And I have a count of $31,750,000 that goes in various lengths. Is everything in here a mandate?
Not everything. So the mandates are for the Healthy Soils Program, that's $500,000. $5 million for the C3 fund, that Climate Catalytic Capital Fund. 1.5 million to the Department of the Environment for the Climate Justice Corps. 5 million to the Department of Housing and Community Development for the purpose of providing those grants to covered buildings. And then $12 million to the Net Zero School Grant Fund.
So the light-duty fleet is not a mandate?
It's not a mandate.
And the hub, 250,000 is not a mandate?
I don't think the hub is mandated. It does, the bill indicates that there should be one PIN for it, but then otherwise indicates that it should be carried out within MEA's existing resources.
Okay. So then, it looks like it's about 24 million mandated, roughly.
Trust your math.
Just as a point for this committee. Now, some of those mandates are 3 years. The catalytic fund, right? The net zero is 12 million a year for every year. That just gets outgoing, is that correct?
Until 2032.
Okay. And the climate core,
That is
just ongoing?
it's ongoing.
And the low-income buildings, that's a 3-year.
Correct.
So that's all different lengths. But at least for the first 3 years, it looks like it's $24 million in mandates. Okay? Senator Solly?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see that it says there, and you probably might have covered this, 2 mandated appropriations from 24 and terminates 26, but it also says that it imposes a mandate on local government. It says local effects. Is that still in place in the original bill?
Yes. Short answer is yes. So what the local effect, I mean, there's a couple of things that have local implications. One is obviously the to the extent that the Department of the Environment is adopting methane emissions caps for solid waste landfills, a lot of those are run by local jurisdictions. So that would be a piece. The other piece would be the school bus provisions. So the bill does say that local jurisdictions are required to, if, and the bill specifies to the extent that federal, state, and private funding is available. So again, the idea there is to really push local jurisdictions to apply for funds that are out there to do that. And then also to the extent that local jurisdictions are owners of covered buildings, they could be subject to the building energy performance standards.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator King?
I just have one question. I was asking about it last week and really didn't get a good answer. I have gas in my home. What does that do to me 10 years, 15 years down the road?
I mean, so I think the concern that some of the utility companies were raising under the bill as originally introduced was that it would have said that new construction going forward could not have gas for heating or hot water purposes, but it wouldn't have touched existing buildings. However, utilities made the argument that if they couldn't sort of expand that business, that there would sort of be this impetus for them to phase out the existing infrastructure. First of all, the bill no longer has that all-electric code provision in here. So the short answer is there's no immediate effect.
Okay.
Long-term, depending on what, these various studies and things come back with, there might be a movement away from gas, but that's very far down the line and not in the bill.
Okay, thank you.
So, couple more things. What I thought I heard you say was that you want us to prepare an amendment for community solar that is similar to our legislation, and that'd be a friendly amendment for the committee.
Yeah, the chair would prefer that that be done as a floor amendment,
That's fine.
but
Okay.
yes, he's.
All right,
he's
we'll
okay
handle
with
that. Second question I have is, did I hear you say that on the net zero schools, that each jurisdiction has to do one in 10 years?
So the way it's phrased is that one school, to the extent that they're building a school in the next 10 years, one out of those schools should be net zero. Again, it's subject to the IAC could waive that requirement if, A, there's no funding available for it in this school loan fund, or B, the site just isn't suitable. In part because in order to do net zero energy, you really need to be able to put in a geothermal well, and some sites just don't have space for that.
Was there a reason that, 1 in 10 years as opposed to, I imagine there was some testimony that suggested we should do more than that.
Yeah, the thinking was, first of all, with the limitations on funding, to push each jurisdiction to do at least one, with the idea that maybe once they've done one, either they might want to do more or they might learn from that process. So I will say that the committee actually took a site visit to some net zero schools this past interim. And one of the things that we heard was that after building one, even if they weren't necessarily planning on building another net zero school, there were technologies and building techniques that they had learned from that process of building the net zero school that they were planning to reproduce in their next buildings just to make them more energy efficient.
Okay. And then finally, on this climate core, just want to try to understand what is all going on with this, because you're moving it from the trust to the Department of the Environment. We just had a bill already, the Senate President's bill on the core that he's got, which includes the Chesapeake. I guess I'm just trying to wonder, what's the distinguishing factor between all these things, and how many of these different things are we going to be running?
And there are already a number of different cores. The thinking behind the core in this bill is that it's really focused more on climate justice initiatives. It's got a more urban focus than, frankly, a lot of the other, the Chesapeake Conservation Corps, which again is under the Bay Trust, but we also have a Maryland Conservation Corps, which is under the Department of Natural Resources. And again, the idea here was to have something more urban focused, and it's also built in there to have hopefully more interaction with the HBCUs and sort of administering this program. There is language in there that requires them to coordinate with the Maryland Corps Board, which again is that board that's set up under the Senate President's bill. But my understanding of the thought of moving it under the Department of the Environment was that some of the committee members really liked the model of the Department of Natural Resources Maryland Conservation Corps, and thought that having it housed within an agency has some benefits.
Senator Young?
Well, most of my questions are more environmentals, and I'm not going to ask them here because that's not our subject, but I do worry about the cost to the consumers, though, and the reason for going all electric when there's so many, I think, better alternatives. But the two studies, how long are they for? What are they going to cost? And this is a little off for money, but why are they so narrow in focus and just looking at electricity?
So if you want to look at the actual language is on sort of the last page 52 and the very back page of the reprint. The reason that they're so focused on building electrification is because that was the recommendation of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. And they actually had a building transition task force that has been meeting, I think, over the course of a couple of years, and highlighted electrification as a very effective way to reduce emissions from the building sector. That's also under sort of the assumption and understanding that the state, through bills that have been going through the Finance Committee, is really moving towards a much cleaner energy portfolio for the electric grid. So again, the focus on electrification is because that's been the recommendation, and also because that was what was originally in the bill. So to sort of understand, what would really be the implications of that? What would be the implications for the electric grid? And what would the code really look like? Built into that language in there, though, is sort of the understanding that both, or at least the Building Codes Administration, should be looking at industries and sectors that are hard to electrify, or that maybe are inappropriate for electrification.
It's not looking at those that are easy to do something else than electrify.
And that's not the focus of the study, no.
Yeah. That's, well, I'm not going to get into that. That's the weakness of the bill. But no cost or anything on what these studies, or are they just all internal things with no cost? Or?
My understanding is that there has been some discussion about fencing off some money in this year's budget for those studies, but I'm not as sure about that.
And one last one that's not as much money for us, but it's money for somebody. The plants, the infrastructure they're going to have to build, and the way the plants are fired to provide the electricity. Are they addressing that at all?
Yes, so that's the Public Service Commission study here is to, again, look at the implications for the electric grid and what it would really take.
I'm talking about how they fuel the plants that feed the electric grid.
Well, that's part of the renewable energy portfolio that's kind of already happening. So I think the studies for that transition are already underway.
Okay. So,
Sarah Alford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. April, thank you so much. I know this is a complicated bill, and you did very well. On the money piece, and if you don't know the answer, that's fine, but are there any opportunities to overlay federal infrastructure funding into these priorities?
That is certainly the hope, and that is what is anticipated, I think, in parts of the bill. And there is language throughout that sort of says that the state should prioritize the use of federal fundings for some of those mandatory appropriations, and for some of those things in the bill. Off the top of my head, I do know that there is federal money for electric school buses. I believe I don't know if it's been confirmed or if it's one of those that's in a bill that's stuck, but there has been talk of directing more federal money towards green banks, which would include that C3 fund that's being set up in this bill.
Maybe not in the infrastructure bill, but Mr. Chair, I also think there might be federal opportunities in the carbon sequestration of healthy soils. I think that might be coming through another federal bill soon, so that's another opportunity. Thank you.
Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the briefing. A couple quick questions. I represent 3 southern counties, and so obviously there are some concerns, and obviously we're happy that many of the things have been taken out of the legislation. But in one of my counties sits Calvert Cliffs nuclear plant. So is there any provision for in the studies, either by PSC or others, on the study of nuclear energy as we move forward? Calvert Cliff energizes much of our state, so.
There's not, and I will just kind of reiterate that the bill remains kind of agnostic on the question of how electricity is generated, in part because, again, that has traditionally been the purview of the Finance Committee. So the bill doesn't say anything. It's not required, it's not looked at, but it's not prohibited either. It's
Okay, well, then that leads to my second question, the composition of the, well, we understand who's on PSC, but the fund as well as the task force, are there the membership of those bodies? Again, being in the region I'm in, I don't see any biofuel folks there, and we're talking farmland and agriculture and
So the building related work groups, there's really only one building related task force in here, and that's the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force. The focus of that task force is really much more on the creation of financial mechanisms and incentives to get towards building decarbonization, so really energy efficiency measures, and fuel switching to, again, get off on-site burning of fossil fuels and onto the electric grid. So in that group, there's not representatives of the solar or the wind energy force. It's much more financial kind of experts, and then building construction experts. So again, while I'd say that nuclear is not represented on any of these task forces, for the most part, neither is wind or solar or other sort of energy sectors. The one exception might be the work training group, and that one does not have nuclear specifically on it. It does have solar and wind and the fossil fuel
Or any of our
industries.
biofuel folks either, so,
No.
okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Quarterman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of a follow-up on the question from our friend from Montgomery County as well as from Baltimore County. The original bill you spoke before where it talked about the ban on, heating and propane and gas, and that was kind of removed. And I guess my question is, it's my understanding, I just want to make sure this is accurate, because as we talk about the fiscal impact, particularly to potentially some of our local communities, is that still enabling language in there that local counties would be able to do that? So in theory, Montgomery County, if they so choose to move forward with those bans, they could do that?
So that's, I mean, current law is that counties have the ability, the state adopts, it's the baseline, and they've adopted the International Energy Conservation Code as the Maryland energy standards for the state. But local jurisdictions under current law, and it doesn't change in this bill, have the ability to adopt amendments to that for when they enact them at the local level. So it doesn't change. It in no way alters local jurisdiction's authority.
All right, thank you.
Senator Edwards?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand your issue here dealing with money, but in all honesty, about everything in here deals with money in someone's pocketbook, whether it's the state, the federal government, individuals sitting here, whatever. And not having a whole lot of time to look at this, especially since what he did with the bill, I do want to ask one or two kind of deal with money. Talked about school buses, and you said the effort has to be shown that you're trying to get other monies to be able to do this. I mean, it's my understanding and presentation of this bill, electric school buses run somewhere around $300,000+. So who's going to determine whether in my county, where most of them are local contractors, don't make a whole lot of money, who's going to determine whether someone tried hard enough to get state, federal, or wherever other money to buy a school bus?
Just a second. Apologies, I'm just taking a few minutes to find this section. So page 22. So ultimately, it would be up to the county board to decide whether that condition had been met. So the bill says that there are two circumstances under which the county is not required to contract for or acquire the zero-emission buses. And the first is if the Department of the Environment determines that there are no available zero-emission vehicles meeting the performance requirements for the county board's use. And the second is the county board is unable to obtain federal, state, or private funding sufficient to cover the cost difference. So that would be a decision by the county board. Again, and this did come up, the question about the counties that use, which many do, sort of smaller contractors for these buses. You know, ultimately, the requirement is not on the contractor, it's on the county. So they would have to make that decision in sort of their negotiation, whether or not they had gotten the funding, then they could sort of build that into their contract so that the local contractor could acquire the buses. The other thing that is in here in response to some of the discussions with the school bus contractors is that soft prohibition does not apply to the use of any school bus that has an in-service date of July 1st, 2024 or before. So the goal is to push county boards towards negotiating with their contractors to acquire, when they need to acquire new buses, just look into getting the zero-emission buses. But it's not to make them replace buses that are, you know, still in service, that are still good.
Well, excuse me, I understand what you're saying, but coming from a poor county that has a hard enough time meeting the demands of the school board itself, puts a lot more pressure on them, and I don't want someone sitting in an office down here in Baltimore telling Garrett County or Allegheny County, you didn't try hard enough, you still got to get these buses, but we're not going to give you any money. I think that needs to be clarified a little more, not mandating, but saying, you know, we're going to really abide by whatever the locals say on that particular issue. I think it's left wide open, if I might, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarity, am I understanding that you all amended out any new construction is left up to the county so they can either say you have to do total electric, period, and I say this from fact, I have a total electric house that was built in the 70s. Very good, except when electric goes off. So certain counties, if they don't want to do the total electric, they can then allow natural gas, propane, or whatever to be utilized in their home in some manner. Heating their water, heating the house.
Right, so the bill as amended by the committee makes no changes to the statewide building code and doesn't change county's authority in any way.
Okay, you mentioned that somebody in the state is going to take some compost out of something, landfills maybe, spread it in state forest. Has there been I thought that's what you said, maybe I missed it.
No, so it's a requirement that the state, and specifically it's the Department of Natural Resources, in conjunction with the Department of General Services, just conduct a study of state lands that might be appropriate for use as a composting sites.
Okay, so there's going to be a study.
Correct.
So hopefully the study understands some of that might be bad for the water supply, depending on what's in it. Okay, that's clarifying. And you said something about electric vehicles. I don't know if you said you get a credit or something. What did you say about purchasing electric vehicles? Nothing other than you want people to buy electric vehicles.
So it's not people, it's the state so it sets targets, required targets for the state in acquiring light-duty vehicles and passenger cars for the state vehicle fleet to, again, as they're replacing cars in the fleet, to purchase a certain number of, or a certain percentage of zero-emission vehicles.
So it says zero emission, so it could use hydrogen.
Could be.
Okay, so it's not tied just to electric, could be hydrogen, or with new innovations, we're gonna have a lot of different things in the next couple of years. Okay, I have more questions, but I'll stop, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Okay, any other, Senator Sullivan?
Thank you. Just getting back to one more part, there's a lot of conversation, but I think my concern was, which were many, but anyway. I know there's a task force, there's a study, there is a climate justice program, there is a Maryland Green Band program, there's an oversight fund, there's a kind of like capital fund, there's a zero net school grant fund, and there's other work groups. And again, there's so much going on, as I see. Also talking about, there's a time frame that you have about the net zero vehicles, which are cars, and they have to be by 2030, and light-duty vehicles, which by 2036. Saying all that, I'm just saying there's a lot of this going on, but the different groups of task force, the studies and everything, I know parts are you going to have volunteers and people will be assigned? And I saw some of those and highlighted those that will be appointed, legislators and so forth. How, okay, are we going to have a fund or a surplus or, I guess, appropriations for all these groups, and do we have the details for that?
So, with the exception of the core board and I'd actually just be the core board.
I would just say, because I know you said before, I'm sorry, that there was a task force that already been in place for 2 years that already did some studies. So, but there still says there's going to be another task force.
Right, so and that was under the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, which is a standing body, and they have sort of working groups that they put together on different subjects. So they had done one, originally as the bill came in, it said, let's just do what they recommended. However, even some of the people who were on that working group sort of came back to the committee and said, while we support the general goals of what they said we should do, there needs to be more targeted sort of expert level discussion of how to get there. So again, there's a building transition task force, which is really focused on looking at the sort of the financing, particularly for individual building owners. How do individual building owners sort of get to whatever energy efficiency or electrification requirements wind up being installed. And then the other two, it's the studies are not task forces. One is the Building Codes Administration, which is in the Department of Labor, and then the other is the Public Service Commission, but with some of that work sort of being delegated or required of the public utilities, because they ultimately are the ones who would have to sort of deal with the implications of if there is greater electrification. In terms of funding, as I said, I think there have been some discussions around the Public Service Commission and the Building Codes Administration study and maybe fencing off some money this year. But aside from that, no, there's no specific funding.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Senator Eckert.
Thank you very much. I noticed in a number of these task forces, is the utility industry represented? I haven't gotten through all of the work groups or the task force, but are they at the table on any of these? Because many of those groups have been pretty good at, I know on the shore, have been very good with innovation, and they're on a trajectory to reduce emissions. So I just wondered, and they're the ones, in my estimation, know most about the infrastructure needs. So I guess the first question is, are the utilities represented?
So again, the only real task forces, there's a task force, there's a working group under the Commission on Climate Change that is really about looking at employment and retraining for individuals who are in particularly sort of fossil fuel dependent industries, as there's a movement towards more sort of clean energy industries. And in that one, they're a representative of the energy efficiency industry, the solar energy, the wind industry, geothermal. So not necessarily the utilities, but then the other big one, and so there's the building transition one, which again, it's not particularly utility focused, it's more about builders and financing.
Correct, I understand that, but my concern is that the utilities that I know on the shore are extremely diversified. So they've been making a number of these changes, and that's why, you know, and they brought in experts to be able to make those, and that's why I was thinking that it would be important to have those in the mix, and was that considered? And then, who establishes the infrastructure needs?
So that would be under the Public Service Commission study. And so that is, I mean, the Public Service Commission study, it is a study done in conjunction with the utilities. And they're the ones who look at those infrastructure.
Okay, so the Public
needs.
Service Commission will be doing that. I
Yes.
just wanted to be clear of that. And then,
Yes.
again, my concern is the cost to our local jurisdiction, because if you have, like my colleague from the Western Shore, we have many small jurisdictions that do not have the revenues, and we're struggling to deal with the blueprint right now. That'll be 5 years out. We don't know what we're going to be struggling with because of our new global situation, let alone the pandemic. And we have probably more miles of highways in Dorchester County than in most places other than Garrett County. And we have small school bus contractors. And I don't foresee our county being able to offset the cost of those electric buses. So I just want to make sure we're not adding some unfunded mandates and additional cost to our local jurisdictions when we're talking about financial implications. Would you say?
So the school bus provisions specifically says you don't have to do it if there's not state or federal funding available to offset those costs. And it also said, and particularly to deal with that sort of situation where we understand in more rural counties where potentially there may not be a zero-emission school bus that is suitable, that the Department of the Environment could also waive it if they determine there's not a suitable vehicle.
We can't even get golf carts right now, but anyway, that's another subject. Thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions? All right, is there a motion?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor? Raise your hands, everybody, on this one. Okay. Opposed? Okay. All right, April, thank you very much. We'll be preparing that amendment on the community solar for the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Where's here? Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sitting behind me is Ethan Heath, who I introduced on the floor. He's over here listening to our conversation here, so I just want everybody to see him up close and in person.
Senator Jackson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting that I think we brought this up a couple years ago. President Emeritus Miller on the Senate side and myself and Senator Fisher on the House side, I believe we were granted a very brief study on nuclear energy and the impact of that. So I would certainly at some stage like to revisit that. I mean, we've got that, facility down there that's actually providing energy in our state, and if we're looking to make advancements, I think we ought to make use of what we have. So just wanted to say, thank you.
Very good. Okay, thank you all very much. We're going to break now from this voting session. Health and Human Services is going to begin at 1:30, so just a minute or so.
For them.
Just for them. Every other one will be off, the start time will be off by half an hour. So, public safety will start at 2:30, education at 3:30. And the capital pay-go, just the pay-go, will start at 4:30. And then right after that, whenever that is, the capital budget subcommittee will have its hearing, its public hearing, okay? And for those who are tuning in, and even who want to be in the audience here, for the first decisions for Health and Human Services, it's going to be on Zoom. It's going to be on the standard process that we've used before. For the public, you can view it on YouTube like you have been before. If you were engaged in this before in any way, it will be on YouTube. And for those who may have already come here today or who are on their way here today, it will be broadcast on the TVs in here in this room. So you can certainly sit here and watch it. And we appreciate everybody's willingness to accommodate us on that. The others will all be in this room live. Okay? Not in this room, whatever their perspective room, I apologize. In wherever rooms there are for their standard rooms. Thank you for that correction. Okay, everybody understand?
Can I confirm one more thing?
Yes,
The capital budget report out is at what time?
4:30,
4:30?
the pay-go, okay, it's not the capital budget, no,
Okay.
pay-go capital, which
Okay,
is very
then-
different,
Capital briefings is at what time?
immediately following that.
Okay.
Okay? Everybody got it? Okay, thank you all very much.